The sky above the Eastern Front was not blue. It was blackened by smoke, torn apart by tracers, and split open by engines screaming at full throttle. In the summer of 1943, somewhere over the burning fields near Kursk, a sleek silhouette dove out of the sun. It wasn't armored like a flying tank. It wasn't massive. It wasn't even made mostly of metal. It was wood. And yet that wooden fighter would help bleed the Luftwaffe dry. While Germany trusted engineering precision and heavily armed interceptors like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the fearsome Focke-Wulf Fu-190, the Soviet Union answered with something unexpected: light, agile, brutally efficient. The aircraft was the Yakovlev Yak-9. It would become the most produced Soviet fighter of the war. It would escort bombers to Berlin. It would duel Germany's finest aces. And it would help turn the tide of air superiority on the Eastern Front. This is the story of how a wooden machine helped crush the Luftwaffe. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviet Air Force was shattered. Thousands of aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the first days. Airfields burned. Pilots died before even taking off. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies with brutal efficiency. At the center of Germany's aerial dominance stood the battle-proven Messerschmitt Bf-109, fast, heavily armed, and flown by experienced pilots hardened by campaigns in Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. It carved through outdated Soviet aircraft, like a scythe through wheat. The Red Air Force desperately needed something new, something fast, maneuverable, and easy to build in enormous numbers. Enter Alexander Yakovlev and his design bureau. Before the war, Yakovlev had already introduced the Yakovlev Yak-9, a lightweight fighter built using mixed materials, steel tubing, fabric, and critically, wood. Wood was not a design quirk. It was necessity. Aluminum was scarce. Soviet industry was evacuating eastward beyond the Ural Mountains as German armies advanced. Factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and rebuilt in freezing conditions. Production had to resume fast, and wood was available. From the Yak-1 came improvements: the Yakovlev Yak-7, and eventually, in 1942, the Yak-9, lighter structure, refined aerodynamics, improved fuel capacity. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't heavily armored, but it was exactly what the Soviet Union needed: reliable, adaptable, and deadly in skilled hands. The Yak-9 retained the Klimov inline engine, but designers shaved weight wherever possible. Less wood in non-critical areas, simplified systems. Every kilogram saved meant better climb, tighter turns, faster acceleration. Soviet doctrine didn't seek high-altitude interception over Britain. It needed low to medium-altitude superiority over tank battles, infantry advances, and burning cities. The Yak-9 was optimized for the brutal, close-range air war of the Eastern Front. By 1943, the air war began shifting. Germany's invasion had stalled at Moscow. Stalingrad had swallowed an entire German army. Now, at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, the skies would become just as decisive as the ground, and there the Yak-9 would prove itself. Against the newer variants of the Focke-Wulf 190, Soviet pilots discovered something crucial: the Yak-9 could outturn them. It could climb competitively at combat altitudes, and it was forgiving, easier for newly trained pilots to handle compared to earlier Soviet designs. The Luftwaffe still possessed better radios, often better coordination, and many experienced aces. But Germany was fighting on multiple fronts now. Veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Soviet production, meanwhile, was accelerating. Factories in Siberia and Central Asia were pushing fighters off assembly lines in astonishing numbers. Quantity became quality. By late 1943, Yak-9 units were appearing everywhere, escorting Il-2 ground attack aircraft, sweeping ahead of bomber formations, intercepting German reconnaissance planes. The wooden fighter was no longer experimental. It was everywhere. But what truly made the Yak-9 dangerous wasn't just numbers. It was adaptability. Variants appeared rapidly. Yak-9T with a powerful 3700 cannon capable of shredding bombers, even threatening armored aircraft. Yak-9D with extended range for deep escort missions. Yak-9U with improved engine performance and speed, capable of challenging even late-war German fighters. Soviet engineers weren't chasing perfection. They were chasing momentum, constant incremental improvement. Fix, modify, reinforce, improve engine cooling, reduce drag, increase firepower. Meanwhile, Germany faced fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and increasing Allied bombing in the West. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin. The Eastern Front was no longer a playground for German aces, it was a grinder. And inside that grinder flew thousands of Yak-9s. By 1944, something unthinkable in 1941 had happened. The Red Air Force was contesting, and increasingly controlling, the skies. The wooden wonder had matured into a weapon of strategic dominance. Air superiority isn't won in a single dogfight. It's earned day after day. Through relentless pressure, the Yak-9 became the backbone of Soviet fighter regiments during the great offensives of 1944. As the Red Army advanced westward through Ukraine, Belarus, and into Poland, Yak-9s flew ahead of the columns. They strafed retreating convoys. They intercepted German Stukas. They dueled fighters attempting to protect collapsing Wehrmacht units. German pilots began noticing something troubling. The Soviets were no longer disorganized. They were coordinated. Radar coverage improved. Ground control interception tactics matured. Soviet pilots gained combat experience and survived long enough to refine their skills. Aces emerged. Pilots who had learned through the catastrophic losses of 1941-42 were now veterans. They knew how German pilots preferred to fight: high-speed slashing attacks, vertical maneuvers, exploiting engine power. The Yak-9 excelled in horizontal turning combat at low and medium altitudes. Soviet doctrine adapted accordingly: forced turning fights dragged German fighters lower. Use numbers. The Yak-9U variant entering service in 1944 raised the stakes further. Faster and better armed, it could reach speeds rivaling late-war German fighters. Suddenly, the technological gap had narrowed dramatically. The Luftwaffe still had formidable aircraft, but circumstances were deteriorating. Fuel shortages meant less pilot training. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with minimal flight hours. Veteran German aces were overworked, flying multiple sorties per day. Meanwhile, Soviet production lines kept rolling. By war's end, nearly 17,000 Yak-9s would be produced, making it the most numerous Soviet fighter of the conflict. Numbers changed tactics. Soviet commanders could now assign dedicated escort fighters, separate air superiority sweeps, and reserve units. The Red Air Force was no longer reacting, it was shaping the battlefield. During Operation Bagration in 1944, the massive Soviet offensive that destroyed Germany's Army Group Center, Yak-9s dominated forward airspace. German reconnaissance flights were intercepted more frequently. Close air support for retreating Wehrmacht forces became riskier. The Luftwaffe was slowly being pushed out of the sky, and by 1945, as Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin, Yak-9s escorted bombers striking targets deep inside German territory itself. The psychological shift was immense. In 1941, German aircraft roamed freely over Soviet cities. Now Soviet fighters crossed into the heart of the Reich. The wooden fighter that once defended Moscow was now flying over Germany. Air superiority is rarely absolute. But by the final year of the war, on the Eastern Front, it was the Red Air Force that dictated terms, and at the center of that dominance was the Yak-9. When the war ended in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities burned. Armies were shattered. The Luftwaffe, once feared across the continent, had been reduced to fragments. The Yak-9 had not won the war alone. No aircraft ever does. Victory was industrial, strategic, and human. But the Yak-9 symbolized something powerful: adaptation under pressure. It proved that cutting-edge aluminum wasn't always necessary. That simplicity could be lethal. That mass production, combined with continuous refinement, could overwhelm even technically sophisticated enemies. The aircraft continued serving after the war, exported to Allied nations and used in early Cold War conflicts. But its greatest achievement remained the skies of the Eastern Front. It helped transform the Red Air Force from a shattered force in 1941 into a dominant power by 1945. It fought from the defense of Moscow to the assault on Berlin. It was fast enough, agile enough, deadly enough, and above all, It was available in numbers that changed history. The Luftwaffe entered the war with experience and confidence. It left broken, exhausted, and outproduced. And somewhere in that collapse was the steady, relentless presence of a wooden fighter, climbing into the smoke-filled skies, day after day, until the balance tipped forever. The Yak-9 did not rely on myth. It relied on momentum, and in total war, momentum wins. By 1944, the air war over the Eastern Front had transformed into something brutal, intimate, and deeply personal. This was no longer the one-sided slaughter of 1941. Now, every climb into the sky carried equal risk for both sides. The Luftwaffe still fielded elite veterans, men who had accumulated dozens, even hundreds, of kills. Among them was the legendary ace Erich Hartmann, whose name would become synonymous with aerial lethality. Flying advanced variants of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, Hartmann and others like him relied on speed, surprise, and ruthless discipline. They attacked from altitude, struck fast, and disengaged before Soviet pilots could respond. But something had changed. The skies were no longer thinly populated. Soviet formations were thicker, tighter, better coordinated. Yak-9 units were flying layered patrol patterns. Instead of isolated duels, engagements became swirling storms of aircraft, dozens at a time. The Yakovlev Yak-9 thrived in that chaos. It wasn't the fastest aircraft in a straight dive. It didn't climb as sharply as the very latest German variants at high altitude. But in the low and medium altitudes, where most Eastern Front combat occurred, it was deadly. Its tight turning radius forced German pilots into close engagements. Its light airframe responded quickly to control input. It forgave small mistakes, and that forgiveness mattered, because by 1944, the Soviet Union was producing not just aircraft, but pilots. Training programs had improved. Combat tactics had matured. Survivors from earlier catastrophic years were now squadron leaders. They had learned painful lessons in blood. Soviet pilots began coordinating vertical traps. One section would bait German fighters into a turning contest, while another dove from above. Radios improved. Ground control stations tracked German movements. The once chaotic Red Air Force was evolving into a synchronized weapon. German pilots began reporting something unsettling in after-action briefings. The Russians weren't breaking anymore. They weren't scattering at the first pass. They were counterattacking. In prolonged engagements, the Yak-9's lighter structure allowed quicker sustained turns at operational altitudes. In a horizontal dogfight, that wooden fighter could pivot tightly enough to bring its nose-mounted cannon to bear before a heavier opponent could react. And then there was the Yak-9T, armed with a 37mm cannon. One hit could obliterate a fighter. German bombers and reconnaissance aircraft felt particularly vulnerable. Even heavily armored aircraft were not safe from that brutal single-shot punch. Yet this was no one-sided reversal. German aces still scored heavily. The skies were merciless. For every Yak that landed with victory marks painted beneath the cockpit, another lay burning in a distant field. But statistics began shifting. The Luftwaffe's pool of veterans shrank steadily. Replacement pilots arrived with far fewer flight hours. Fuel shortages limited training. Aircraft sat grounded due to maintenance shortages. Meanwhile, Yak-9 regiments rotated pilots more systematically. New aircraft arrived constantly. Damaged machines were replaced quickly. Soviet industry had learned the rhythm of total war. The duel of aces was no longer about individual brilliance. It was about endurance, and endurance favored the side that could replace both machines and men faster. By late 1944, even elite German units were increasingly defensive, scrambling to intercept rather than dominate. The Yak-9 had not eliminated the Luftwaffe's skill, but it had stripped away its advantage. The sky was becoming red. As the Red Army surged westward through Poland and into East Prussia, air strategy shifted again. This was no longer purely defensive air superiority over Soviet territory. Now it was projection of power. The Yak-9's extended range variants, particularly the Yak-9D and later improvements, enabled deep escort missions. Soviet bombers were flying farther west, striking supply hubs, rail junctions, and defensive positions behind German lines. The wooden fighter, that once guarded retreating Soviet columns, was now escorting offensive formations toward the German heartland. German resistance in the air was still dangerous, especially from concentrated defensive pockets, but the Luftwaffe was stretched thin across collapsing fronts. Western Allied bombing campaigns forced Germany to defend its western skies heavily, draining resources from the east. The Eastern Front air war began tilting decisively. Soviet formations operated in overwhelming numbers. Where once German fighters roamed freely, they now faced layered screens of Yak-9s. Attempts to intercept bombers increasingly resulted in losses. Soviet pilots grew bolder. Strafing runs hit airfields. German aircraft were destroyed on the ground, a grim echo of what the Luftwaffe had done to the Soviets in 1941. History had turned in a brutal circle. By early 1945, as Soviet artillery thundered toward Berlin, Yak-9s flew constant patrols over advancing armored spearheads. They hunted remnants of German air resistance. They guarded bridges and supply convoys. The Luftwaffe was no longer fighting for dominance. It was fighting for survival. And in the final months of the war, Soviet aircraft crossed into German airspace, not as desperate defenders, but as conquerors. The Yak-9 had evolved alongside the war itself. It began as a necessity born of scarcity. It ended as a symbol of industrial momentum and operational mastery. Its wooden frame, once seen as a compromise, proved resilient under combat stress. Its adaptability allowed rapid upgrades. Its mass production ensured constant pressure. By the time Soviet forces raised their flag over Berlin, the sky above them was largely secured. The wooden wonder had escorted history itself to its conclusion. Air superiority is not just about speed or firepower. It is about presence. The Yak-9 achieved dominance through a combination of factors that, together, became overwhelming. First, production. Nearly 17,000 units meant constant reinforcement. Losses, while painful, did not cripple operational strength. Second, adaptability. From heavy cannon variants to long-range escorts to improved high-performance models, the design evolved continuously without halting production. Third, operational alignment. The Yak-9 was perfectly suited for the altitudes and tactical realities of the Eastern Front. It excelled where it needed to excel, not in theoretical performance charts, but in muddy, smoke-filled battle zones. Fourth, pilot experience growth. As the war progressed, surviving Soviet aviators became highly competent combat leaders. By 1944-45, many Yak pilots were battle-hardened veterans. Finally, enemy attrition. Germany's industrial strain, fuel shortages, and pilot losses compounded year after year. Even excellent aircraft cannot compensate for empty fuel tanks and rushed training programs. The Yak-9 did not defeat the Luftwaffe in a single climactic engagement. It exhausted it, day after day, sortie after sortie, factory after factory. In total war, the side that sustains pressure longest often prevails. The wooden wonder sustained that pressure, and when the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the transformation was undeniable. The Red Air Force stood as one of the dominant air powers in the world, forged in catastrophe, rebuilt in fire, and carried forward on wooden wings. As Berlin burned and the Third Reich collapsed, the sky above Europe belonged to a fighter few believed in at the start of the war. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the most armored. It wasn't made of shining aluminum. It was wood. But the Yakovlev Yak-9 outlasted the fear of the Messerschmitt Bf 109. It endured the power of the Fock, Luftwaffe 190, and it helped grind down the once unstoppable Luftwaffe. Air superiority wasn't stolen in a single dogfight. It was earned, sortie by sortie, factory by factory, sacrifice by sacrifice. The wooden wonder didn't just fight, it survived. It adapted. And in the end, it dominated the Eastern Front skies. If you enjoyed this deep cinematic documentary, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me, was the Yak-9 underrated? Or was it the true backbone of Soviet air power? And don't forget to subscribe for more untold World War II aviation stories. Because history isn't just written on the ground. Sometimes, it's carved into the sky.